Imagine getting put on active duty, going and jumping out of an airplane, doing your duty to our country during the Cold War and the fear of communism spreading to the rest of the country. Fighting an enemy that is men, women, and children using guerrilla warfare tactics, no uniforms, not knowing who's the real enemy and who is. Learning to use their own guerrilla warfare tactics right back at them and be just as brutal. Somebody who doesn't agree with the war but swore an oath to protect their country as well as to protect their fellow soldiers. On a secret reconnaissance, step on a landmine, survive, be medevaced, be in the hospital, rehabilitate, learn to walk, and go right back to Vietnam. Master Sergeant Roy Benavidez did. Roy Benavidez was born in Curro, Texas in 1935. Both parents were migrant working farmers. However, both died and they ended up moving with a relative and moved to El Campo, Texas. As a young boy, Roy used to shine shoes to help earn money to help his family out. Eventually, he ended up working at a tire company. By the time he turned 15, he had dropped out of school to help support his family and worked multiple jobs, including picking produce. With the Cold War and the Korean War had kicked off in 1952, Roy Benavidez enlisted in the Texas Army National Guard. This way he could earn a steady living and still help support his family and his siblings. In June of 1955, he switched from the Army National Guard to Army Active Duty, and this is where his adventure truly begins. In 1955, after leaving the reserves and going full-time active duty, Benavidez married his wife Hilaria. He then left for Fort Benning, where he would attend jump school, learn to be a paratrooper, go through more combat training, and then eventually after that he would head over to Fort Bragg and meet up with the 82nd Airborne, one of the United States' most elite paratrooper regiment, very well known throughout the world. Conflict was rising over in Southeastern Asia with Vietnam and the Cold War, communism spreading like wildfire. President Kennedy in the 1960s would end up sending over military personnel or advisors to help assist southern Vietnam against the People's Northern Army socialist efforts. Benavidez would stay at Fort Bragg. He would actually undergo the training, pass the Q course to be accepted in the United States Army Special Forces Unit. The trials and training to go down the route to earn the Green Beret are extremely difficult, invigorating, and have a high turnover rate. Not just learning to be a commando, doing free fall jumping, shooting, marksmanship, and also diplomacy, as well as learning how to be an instructor. Benavidez would be assigned to 5th Group, who will play a huge role in the early parts of Vietnam. 5th Group would be sent over as military advisors. These duties would include training, getting together uniforms, gear, weapons, ammunition, teaching basic combat medic treatment, as well as discipline and other survival skills necessary for warfare. There were many special units in Vietnam during that conflict. However, the two that stick out is MACSOG and Benavidez Unit 5th Group. The reason as to why is because the different types of small arms that they had used. Here's some examples of, standard issue or non-conventional small arms. Due to communist influence, especially the aid of China to the northern Vietnamese, President Kennedy had authorized and sent over military advisors. Benavidez Unit, 5th Group of United States Special Forces, deployed to Vietnam, fall of 1965. While in Vietnam, they would conduct operations training the Southern Vietnamese military, reconnaissance, diplomacy. The development with a good relationship with the people of Southern Vietnam was critical at this time in the Cold War. This marked the true beginnings of what unconventional warfare would become with special operations units. The Green Berets were the pioneers of this taking place. While out on a solo reconnaissance mission, Benavidez had stepped on a landmine and survived. Stepping on the landmine and surviving, Benavidez was medically evacuated to the United States. Doctors at the Fort Sam Houston concluded he was never going to be able to walk again and began preparing his medical discharge papers. Not finding the doctor's diagnosis acceptable, seeing the carnage taking place in Vietnam while he was in the hospital, Benavidez began an unsanctioned nightly training ritual in an attempt to redevelop his ability to walk. Against doctor's orders, Benavidez would crawl using his elbows and chin to a wall near his bedside. He would prop himself against the wall and attempt to lift himself unaided, started by wiggling his toes, then his feet, and then eventually, after several months of excruciating practice by his own admission, pushing himself up the wall with his ankles and legs. After over a year of hospitalization, Benavidez walked out of the hospital July of 1966 with his wife at his side, determined to return to combat in Vietnam. Stepping on the landmine and surviving, Benavidez was medically evacuated to the United States. Doctors at the Fort Sam Houston concluded he was never going to be able to walk again and began preparing his medical discharge papers. Not finding the doctor's diagnosis acceptable, seeing the carnage taking place in Vietnam while he was in the hospital, Benavidez began an unsanctioned nightly training ritual in an attempt to redevelop his ability to walk. Against doctor's orders, Benavidez would crawl using his elbows and chin to a wall near his bedside. He would prop himself against the wall and attempt to lift himself unaided, started by wiggling his toes, then his feet, and then eventually, after several months of excruciating practice by his own admission, pushing himself up the wall with his ankles and legs. After over a year of hospitalization, Benavidez walked out of the hospital July of 1966 with his wife at his side, determined to return to combat in Vietnam. Benavidez returned to South Vietnam in 1968. On May 2nd, a 12-man Special Force Patrol, which included 9 Montagnard tribesmen, was surrounded by Northern Vietnamese Army Infantry Battalion. Benavidez heard the radio appeal for help and boarded his helicopter to respond. Only armed with a knife, he jumped from the helicopter, which was 30 to 40 feet off the ground, carrying his medicine bag, and ran to help the trapped patrol. Benavidez distinguished himself by a series of daring and extremely valorous actions, and because of his gallant choice to join voluntarily, his comrades who were in critical states, to expose himself constantly to withering enemy fire, and his refusal to be stopped despite numerous severe wounds that saved the lives of at least 8 men in his unit. What would be known as the 6 hours of hell. Benavidez had rescued 8 men. During some point in this battle, Benavidez had been stabbed with a bayonet. Benavidez pulled it out, drew his own knife, and killed the Viet Cong. He later killed 2 more Northern Vietnamese soldiers with AK-47 while providing cover fire for the people boarding the helicopter. After the battle, he was evacuated to base camp, examined, and thought to be dead. As they placed his body in a body bag, and among the other dead bodies in the body bags, he was suddenly recognized by a friend. The doctor had considered Benavidez to be dead, and as he was zipping up the body bag, Benavidez spit blood in his face, showing him that he was still alive. Benavidez had a total of 37 separate bullet, bayonet, and shrapnel wounds from the 6-hour fight he had with the enemy battalion of Viet Cong and Northern Vietnamese Army. This was a true act of valor. Benavidez was evacuated once again to Fort Sam Houston's Brooke Army Medical Center, where he eventually recovered. He received the Distinguished Service Cross for extraordinary heroism and 4 Purple Hearts. In 1969, he was assigned to Fort Riley, Kansas. In 1972, he was assigned to Fort Sam Houston, Texas, where he remained up until his retirement. In 1973, after more detailed accounts became available, Special Forces Lieutenant Colonel Ralph R. Drake insisted Benavidez receive the Medal of Honor. By then, however, the time limit on the medal had expired. An appeal to Congress resulted in an exemption for Benavidez, but the Army Decorations Board denied him an upgrade of his Distinguished Service Cross to the Medal of Honor. The Army required an eyewitness account from someone present during the action. Benavidez believed that there were no living witnesses of the events of that day, which by then had become known as the 6 Hours of Hell. Unbeknownst to Benavidez, there was one survivor. Unbeknownst to Benavidez, Brian O'Connor, the former radio man of Benavidez' Special Forces team in Vietnam, had stepped forward out of the shadows and verified the valorous actions. On February 24, 1981, President Ronald Reagan presented Roy P. Benavidez
Congressional Medal of Honor, given only for service above and beyond the call of duty. Secretary Weinberger, would you please escort Sergeant Benavidez forward. Ladies and gentlemen, we're honored to have with us today Master Sergeant Roy P. Benavidez, U.S. Army, retired. Let me read the plain, factual military language of the citation that was lost for too long a time. Master Sergeant Roy P. Benavidez, United States Army, retired for conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity in action at the risk of his life above and beyond the call of duty.
After his retirement, Roy Benavidez would go on doing public speaking, as well as an activist for veteran affairs and education. Roy would go on to write 3 separate books. The G.I. Joe toy company even made a G.I. Joe modeled after Roy. And multiple Hollywood films where he had used Roy's story as the basis for the show. On November 29, 1998, Roy had passed away from complications of diabetes. His valorous actions went on, and there have been many memorials dedicated to Roy, even in his hometown, Corano. Sections of the highways in the state of Texas in memory of Roy. Roy the Unkillable died only because he was ready to move on to the next life. Thank you for your service, sir.